Week 16 is here, and if you made the finals, good for you, good job. And here's the top 30 running backs heading into Week 16. The first one's Derrick Henry of the Tennessee Titans. Derrick Henry, he's been a fantasy stud and a monster this season, and he's looking to close in on 2,000 yards now this season. Henry's got a great matchup versus the Green Bay Packers that give up the 5th most fantasy points to running backs. Last week, Henry, another solid ball game, 160 yards on the ground, and he found the end zone twice. And I think in this game, Henry can have his way once again with this Green Bay Packer defense, and it won't surprise me if he could get 150 to 170 total yards and 2 touchdowns in this one. The second guy's Dalvin Cook of the Minnesota Vikings. Cook last week versus a tough Chicago Bears defense. He did work, Cook. He had a big game. He found the end zone. And this guy, he's a dual threat out of the backfield. I know he got banged up a little bit with the injury on his ankle, but I think Cook's good to go. He had a stud performance. And him and Henry, these guys are definitely number 1 and 2 the whole season at the running back position. And this week, I wouldn't think anything less from these 2 running backs. I think Cook, he could have 150 to 200 total yards as well in this game versus the New Orleans Saints, who you could run on. We saw it last week that the Chiefs did a decent job with Le'Veon Bell in the backfield, so I think Cook could have a good one. Number 3, Alvin Kamara was staying in the same game. This is a Christmas game on Friday, by the way, with the Saints and the Minnesota Vikings. And Kamara, now with Drew Brees back, Kamara's numbers should go up over there in New Orleans. He's got a good matchup versus Minnesota, where we saw David Montgomery explode for a big game versus them as well last week. And Kamara, I could see a tons of catches in this one, 7 or 8 catches and about 110 to 130 total yards for him in this one and finding the end zone. So Kamara, it's been a great season for him. I know he had a few off weeks, but this week I think it's a big week. Number 4, Aaron Jones of the Green Bay Packers. Jones, he's been pretty solid, and last week he had a 26-point fantasy day. Aaron Rodgers didn't have the greatest of games, so Aaron Jones carried the Packers in that backfield to victory last week versus the Carolina Panthers. And this week, I think this game versus Tennessee is going to be a shootout for Jones and company. And I think Jones, he could find the end zone maybe twice in this one. He's a decent pass catcher out of the backfield. And the last few weeks, it seems like Aaron Jones, he's been getting healthier as well. So Jones in this game, he's a full workhorse load. You know, Green Bay, they're going to play for that first seed, so they're going to keep trying. And I think Jones can have a big game in this one. Number 5, Nick Chubb of the Cleveland Browns. Every week, Chubb either gets 100 yards or finds the end zone. And this week versus the New York Jets, I think he's going to do both as Chubb. Chubb is a monster. He's a top running back in this league, and this guy's only in his 2nd year. And he's doing tons of work. And the Jets this week, they're not going to have an answer for Chubb. I think Chubb could have a huge game and possibly finish the week as a top performer, but I'm going to stick with him here in number 5. And Chubb, he's on a lot of rosters that made it to the finals, I noticed, in some of the leagues I'm in, and just seeing forums online. So Nick Chubb, I think, has a big game and could help you win the title easily this week. Number 6, Christian McCaffrey of the Carolina Panthers. He was the first pick overall pretty much in every fantasy draft coming into the season, and this week it's still up in the air if he's going to play or not. He was supposed to come back last week, but he was a quick scratch. But this week at Washington, it's a decent matchup. You know, Christian McCaffrey, the usage is out of control. How many times a game he touches the ball and how many routes he runs too as a running back for this Carolina Panther offense. So Christian McCaffrey, I think he can have a good game. I think he'll get the full workload. They want to unleash McCaffrey. They paid him a lot of money this season. I know Carolina is out of the race, but CMC, he's the type of player who loves to play, and he's not just in it for the money. So I think this week, if he comes back, he can have a 20 to 25-point fantasy day. Number 7, Miles Sanders of the Philadelphia Eagles. Sanders, he's been up and down most of the season, but this week he's got a great matchup at the Dallas Cowboys that we just saw the San Francisco backfield have a good ball game. And every week, the whole season, teams have run for, it seems like 150 to 200 yards a game versus this Dallas defense. And I think Sanders can have a monster game in this one, especially with his breakaway speed. And he's had a couple home run shots this season where he would take one to the house for a 70 or 80-yard touchdown. And I think this week he might be able to do it at Dallas. Number 8, Austin Ekeler of the Los Angeles Chargers. Ekeler, he had a down game according to his standards last week on that Thursday night football game versus the Vegas Raiders. And this week it's a mediocre matchup versus another division rival in the Denver Broncos. But Ekeler, he's a dual threat out of the backfield. This guy's got breakaway speed, and he could have some huge games with 9-10 catches a game as well. That's just the type of back he is. And this week versus Denver, I think he'll have a bounce-back performance and a pretty good, solid fantasy day. So he's number 8. Number 9, David Montgomery of the Chicago Bears. He's been running like a man possessed the last few weeks, is Montgomery, and he's been a top 10 performer in the last 4 weeks. And Montgomery with another great matchup at the Jacksonville Jaguars this week. Montgomery, he's gone over 100 yards. He's finding the end zone, and this whole Bear offense as a whole, with Mitch Trubisky under center, is getting better for their team and obviously fantasy football. And Montgomery this week at Jacksonville, I think he'll put up similar numbers like he's been doing. 25 to 30 fantasy points is very possible. Number 10, Chris Carson of the Seattle Seahawks. Last week, Carlos Hyde vultured a touchdown after taking a big one to the house for a 60-yard touchdown. But Chris Carson, he's been pretty solid since he came back from injury a few weeks ago. And this week versus the Los Angeles Rams, I think they're going to have to run the ball a lot, is the Seattle team. Russ, he's just been in a slump, it seems like, the last few weeks is Russell Wilson. And in a division matchup, it's going to be a grinded-out type of ball game with Seattle and Los Angeles. And I think Chris Carson, he's going to have a decent game. He could catch a couple passes out of the backfield as well that could help your fantasy team. So I'd like Carson at number 10. Number 11, DAndre Swift of the Detroit Lions. Swift, he's been playing well since he came back from a 3-week absence a few weeks ago. And this week versus Tampa Bay, I think we're going to see a lot of screens and even some plays where Swift's going to line up as a receiver out of the backfield for this team. They got a tough matchup versus Tampa. Detroit's probably going to be down in this game, or most of it, or go off to a big lead and then have to play catch-up. But either way, Swift, I think he could get 90 to 110 total yards and find the end zone in this one. And he's getting a lot of work now, and why not? Detroit's rebuilding. Their season's over in far terms of making the playoffs. So Swift's going to get a good workload. Number 12, James Robinson of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He usually cracks my top 8 or 9 is Robinson, but this week it's because of the matchup versus the Chicago Bears. And last week, Robinson, he caught a nice wheel route to find the end zone. And this week for Chicago, it's a tough matchup, like I said. They give up the third least of fantasy points to running backs, is the Chicago Bears. So I think Robinson, he might have a tough time with his receiving yards out of the backfield. Robinson, he still puts up solid games, and like I said, each and every week you could expect anywhere from 15 to 30 fantasy points from him, and this week I think it could be that type of game. Number 13, Josh Jacobs of the Las Vegas Raiders. Jacobs, he's been inconsistent most of the season here in fantasy football, and it has to do with his workload, and last week he didn't do much until the end of the game where a goal line touchdown saved him. So Jacobs, he had 20 fantasy points last week, but this week versus Miami, it's going to be a tougher test. This Miami defensive line is pretty strong and stout, and they don't give up a lot of rushing yards to running backs, and we've seen it happen now over the last few weeks. So Jacobs, he could still get 70 and 80 total yards in this one, I believe, with a touchdown, but I wouldn't have crazy expectations for him in this one. Number 14, Leonard Fournette, another week. It looks like he's going to get the starting reins back there for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and it looks like Ronald Jones isn't going to play. The early reports come out here on Wednesday, but Leonard Fournette, he found the end zone twice last week. He's a big back. He's going to get most of the work, and he could catch some balls out of the backfield. And last week, Fournette, solid fantasy game, 22 fantasy points. And this week at Detroit, in a pretty solid matchup where they give up the 6th most fantasy points to running backs, I think Fournette, he could find that 15 to 20 range in fantasy points. Number 15, Antonio Gibson of the Washington football team. Gibson, he's been out 2 weeks now, and these last 2 games they've lost is the Washington football team. And they got a mediocre matchup versus the Carolina Panthers that we saw Aaron Jones have a big game versus last week. So if Gibson's healthy with this toe injury this week, I think he have a good game versus Carolina where he could get 100 total yards and possibly find the end zone. But we don't know how he'll react coming off the injury after sitting out a few games here. And if Dwayne Haskins starts or whatever, that's going to be trouble for Washington. They're going to try to force him as Carolina for Haskins to beat him. Number 16, Le'Veon Bell of the Kansas City Chiefs. We know Clyde Edwards-Helaire, he's out the rest of the regular season with a leg and a groin injury. And Le'Veon Bell, he looked decent last week, 70 total yards, and he found the end zone. And this week I got him in the league, and I'm starting him as well. I like the matchup versus Atlanta. You know, Bell, he's a dual threat. I know he's not as good as he was in Pittsburgh. His best days are behind him, but he could still help fantasy teams out here in the championship or your third-round game. And I think Bell, he could put up 13 to 15 fantasy points and have a decent game here with a starting role. Number 17, J.K. Dobbins of the Baltimore Ravens. Dobbins each and every week, I say. I just hope they give this guy the full reins back there in Baltimore. Gus Edwards and him pretty much is splitting, and Dobbins more the passing downs back. But Dobbins, his yards per carry are probably 6 or 7 per carry this season. He's got breakaway speed. He's an explosive running back, and the reason Baltimore drafted him in the NFL draft this season in the second round. So Dobbins, hopefully he gets a big workload. I know it's a mediocre matchup versus a pretty stout Giant front seven, but J.K. Dobbins, this guy's got potential, and he's been helping teams the last few weeks here in the playoffs with good performances, and I think he could do it again here this week. Number 18, Jonathan Taylor, the Indianapolis Colts. This rookie's had a good season as well, especially the last 3 or 4 weeks. Taylor's had some big games, but this week he's number 18 on my list because of the matchup versus the Pittsburgh Steelers that give up the least amount of fantasy points to running backs. So this game, Taylor, he might have trouble finding holes and getting openings, but I still think he could put up RB2 numbers for your fantasy team with his receiving abilities out of the backfield and his breakaway speed as well. So I like him at 18. I think he could still have a decent game, but it wouldn't surprise me if he has a dud performance too versus this D. Number 19, Kareem Hunt of the Cleveland Browns. Hunt, obviously the second back over there in Cleveland, but he still gets a decent workload, anywhere from 12 to 15 total touches a ball game. And this week he's got a master matchup versus the New York Jets that give up the most fantasy points to running backs. So Hunt, him and Chubb could have huge games. This is a game where they possibly both could go over 80 total yards and a touchdown each in this one. So Hunt, he's a safe running back number 2 this week. Number 20, Melvin Gordon of the Denver Broncos. Gordon last week, he found the end zone twice. I know some of it was in garbage time versus the Buffalo Bills, but Gordon, he looked good. He had 24 fantasy points in PPR leagues, and this week he's got a matchup versus his former team, the Los Angeles Chargers. You know, Gordon, he's going to be amped up. He's going to want to prove these guys wrong, that they didn't give him that contract that he wanted as Gordon. And I wouldn't be surprised if Gordon, he has 80, 90 total yards, and he finds the end zone versus his former mates. Number 21, David Johnson of the Houston Texans. Last week, it looked like David Johnson of old in that ball game for the Texans versus the Indianapolis Colts. He had 10 catches out of the backfield, and he was doing a little bit of everything as Johnson. And this week, I don't expect 10 catches out of him, but I expect a decent game and a running back 2 option here versus Cincinnati defense that you can make plays on and get down the field. That defense, they're not that good. And David Johnson, I think he could get 50, 60 total yards and find the end zone here. Number 22, Ezekiel Elliott of the Dallas Cowboys. He's got a mediocre matchup this week versus the Philadelphia Eagles. But Elliott, he's been banged up over the last few weeks. And last week, it finally forced him to miss the game versus the San Francisco 49ers was Elliott with the calf injury. Tony Pollard, he filled in well in that game with 2 total touchdowns and over 100 yards total. So if Zeke's out again this week, Tony Pollard, I like him as a fire-up this week. Pollard, he's had more burst and more big plays than Elliott this season. So Elliott, if he plays, he's number 22. And if Pollard, he plays, I keep him in the same spot because it's a similar workload. Pollard, he's better in PPR type of formats because he can catch the ball 4 or 5 times out of the backfield. And like I say, he has breakaway speed, which Zeke really hasn't showed this season. But Elliott's 22, 23, Myles Gaskin of the Miami Dolphins. Gaskin, he got activated off the COVID list, and I think the starting role will go back to him right away this week. And this week, he's got a great matchup versus the Las Vegas Raiders, who give up the fourth most fantasy points to running backs. So Gaskin, he was doing good until he got injured or got COVID the last few weeks. Salvin Ahmed, he filled in well last week with 123 yards on the ground. So Gaskin, I think he's going to get the decent workload, and he's a decent start this week. He's number 23. 24, James Conner of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He pretty much hasn't been fantasy relevant the last few weeks with injuries or poor performances, and I think Pittsburgh, they sat him out on that Monday night game figuring it was going to be an easy victory, and they didn't need Conner in that one, which they were wrong about. They lost the game, but Benny Snell had a good ball game with 107 total yards and a touchdown. But this week, Conner, he's got a tough matchup, even if he does play here, versus the Indianapolis Colts, who are a stout defense. They make you earn every yard you got to get. And this week, Conner, I'm not in love with him at 24. And I don't think he's a great option this week, but he's better than the last few guys I got on this list. Number 25, Kenyon Drake of the Arizona Cardinals. It's been a roller coaster season for Drake with great games, bad games, injuries. And this week he's got a good matchup, though, versus the San Francisco 49ers that I mentioned a few minutes ago that Tony Pollard tore up. So Kenyon Drake, I think he could have a good game this week where he could find the end zone and get 100 total yards in this one. So I don't think he's the worst of plays, but he's also a guy that could go the other way and have a bad game. Number 26, Nyheim Hines of the Indianapolis Colts. He's got a tough matchup versus the Pittsburgh Steelers, but with his third down role built in and his passing downs role, for the most part, Nyheim Hines, he's been a good fantasy player now. For 6 or 7 weeks, he's had good fantasy games, and this week versus Pittsburgh, I think they're going to use him in a variety of ways out of the backfield to try to make plays as this Colt offense. Phillip Rivers, he trusts Hines. They line him up as a receiver as well at times as Hines. And I think he could have a decent game versus Pittsburgh, even though it's a tough matchup on paper. But he's more of a receiver out of the backfield than a running back for this Colt team. Number 27, Tevin Coleman of the San Francisco 49ers. Last week, Mostert went down again. We don't know his status. And then Jeffrey Wilson on one of the last plays of the ball game sprained his ankle versus the Dallas Cowboys, so we don't know if he's going to play. And this week, Tevin Coleman, it looks like he might be the next man up over there in Frisco. That backfield's been injured all season, where they had to go to the fourth string and fifth string guys and McKinnon and Jermichael Hasty at times. But Tevin Coleman, he should get the workload here. Like I said, if Wilson and Mostert are out, and the matchup's not too bad versus Arizona. Last week, we saw Miles Sanders have a decent game, and Jalen Hurts even run on him for 63 yards. Number 28, Darrell Henderson of the Los Angeles Rams. Cam Akers already this early in the week, he was pronounced out of this ball game, and it looks like Henderson and Brown, they'll be splitting in the backfield over there for the Los Angeles Rams, but I still give the upper edge to Henderson getting the most work out of the backfield here, with Brown coming in on a few downs. But I think Henderson will get 60 to 70% of the work out of the backfield. You know, he's not going to catch the ball, but he's going to be the goal line back and in between the tackles. And Henderson, he's got some flashes as well where he could break one. So hopefully, if you're desperate and you got to start Henderson here in your championship or a third-round game, hopefully Henderson, he gets the job done and he could do something. Number 29, Damian Harris of the New England Patriots. Last week he was scratched late on that Saturday night and he missed the ball game for the Pats. This week versus Buffalo, we'll see if he gets in the game, and if he does, I think he could have a decent game. Harris, he's a pretty good running back, but the problem with him, he don't catch the ball out of the backfield, but he's still going to get carries, he's still going to get work. So right here, I got him in number 29, and the 30th and final running back I got on the rankings this week's IDO Smith of the Atlanta Falcons. Raheem Morris said Smith's the man right now in the backfield. Todd Gurley, he hasn't looked the same like he did early in the season, and I've been saying this the whole season pretty much. Gurley, he's got a bad knee. It's always going to linger throughout his career. He's just got bad knees, unfortunately. And Gurley, he was touchdown dependent, and without the touchdown, you've seen the 3 to 5 point fantasy days. So IDO Smith, he's a dual threat out of the backfield. He can make a couple catches a game, and he's also a decent runner in between the tackles. So I think he's a sneaky play this week at Kansas City, because even if they're going to be down early, which most likely is going to happen, I think IDO Smith, he could rack up 5 or 6 catches in this one, and he could be a player that has a good PPR day. So that's the top 30 running backs here heading into Week 16.